The elevator was too quiet. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the marble walls, not the way the city bled gold and silver 37 floors below, not even my own reflection staring back at me with rain-soaked hair and mascara that had long since surrendered. Just the silence, the kind that lives in expensive buildings where no one raises their voice and every surface has been chosen to make you feel small. I pressed the button for the penthouse and watched the doors close, and I told myself I was doing the right thing. I told myself this was professional courtesy. I told myself 100 different things in the space of 10 seconds, and every single one of them was a lie, because the truth was too large and too embarrassing to fit inside that elevator with me. The truth was that I had destroyed Serafina Calloway in front of 200 people, and she hadn't deserved a single word of it. My shoes were soaked through. I'd left my umbrella in the cab, and I hadn't thought to go back for it. Because I was running, because I needed to get here before I lost the nerve, before the guilt calcified into something I could ignore for longer than one night. The hem of my coat dripped quietly onto the polished floor. I watched the puddle form, and I thought, even my body is confessing. The elevator opened. The hallway was dim and long, lined with two doors. One to the left, clearly staff access, and one at the far end, dark wood, no number, no nameplate. Just a single brass handle, and the knowledge that behind it lived the most terrifying woman I had ever spent years trying to outrun. I walked to the door. I raised my hand. I held it there for what felt like a very long time. Then I knocked. There was a pause. Not a confused pause, not a startled pause. A deliberate one. As if she had known I was in the elevator. As if she had known I was coming before I knew it myself. The door opened, and there she was. Serafina Calloway. She was wearing a silk robe the color of deep water at midnight. Not navy, not black. Something richer and harder to name. Her dark hair was loose, which I had never seen before. In every photograph, every event, every room we had ever shared, it was always swept up or precision swept back. Loose, it was extraordinary. Curling slightly at the ends, framing a face I had spent years cataloging only for the purpose of finding its weaknesses, and now standing here, soaked and shaking, I could not remember a single one. She looked at me. Her eyes moved from my wet hair to my ruined coat, to the small puddle forming around my shoes on her threshold. Not with disgust, not with satisfaction, with the particular stillness of someone who has been expecting the inevitable. Then she said, in that low, unhurried voice that had commanded boardrooms and silenced journalists, and once apparently made a Parisian investor cry, "You're late." I opened my mouth, closed it again. Because what do you say to that? What do you say when someone you've publicly eviscerated opens their door in midnight silk and implies that your apology simply took longer than expected? I need to talk to you, I managed. She considered me for a moment longer. Then she stepped back from the door, leaving it open behind her. I walked in. Before we return to the story, I just want to share a quick note. This version is made for YouTube, but the uncensored GL scenes and hotter videos will be available on my Patreon. Some moments are too spicy to include here, so if you want the fuller and bolder version, you can find the details in the description below. The penthouse was nothing like I'd imagined, which surprised me, because I had imagined it many times. I'd pictured cold minimalism, steel and glass, the aesthetic of someone who wanted to remind every visitor that warmth was a choice she'd declined to make. Instead, it was warm in the amber lamplit way of rooms that have been lived in rather than staged. There were books on the low shelves, real books with cracked spines, not the kind purchased by the foot to fill space. A single orchid on the kitchen counter, very much alive. A glass of wine on the coffee table, half finished, beside a folder of papers she must have been working through before I knocked. She lived here, actually lived here. That detail undid something small in me. "Sit," she said, disappearing toward what I assumed was a hallway. "I'll get you a towel." I did not sit. I stood in the center of the living room and dripped on her floor and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain lashing the glass from outside, and I thought about how 12 hours ago I had stood at a podium in front of 200 people and called this woman a thief. She came back with a towel, thick, white, absurdly soft, and held it out without comment. "Thank you," I said. She sat down on the sofa and picked up her wineglass and looked at me with an expression I had no name for. Not anger, not contempt. Something older and quieter than both. "You're going to apologize," she said. "You've been rehearsing it since the cab." My jaw tightened. "Is it that obvious? You move your lips when you think." A pause. "You always have." I stared at her. "You've noticed that." "I've noticed quite a few things about you, Rowan." She said my name like it was something she'd been holding in her mouth for a long time and had finally decided to put down. "Sit. You're making the room anxious." I sat. I pressed the towel against my hair with more force than necessary and tried to organize the apology I had been building all the way here. Every careful sentence I'd assembled on the ride over, and found that every single one of them felt inadequate. "I was wrong," I said finally. "Tonight, at the summit. What I said about you, what I accused you of, I was wrong. I know that now, and I need you to know that I know it." She was quiet for a moment. "Go on," she said. "I found something after you left. Evidence that the documents I was shown, the ones proving you stole our Meridian campaign concept, were fabricated, digitally altered. The metadata was wrong. Livia caught it." I paused. "My operations manager. She's been going through everything since this afternoon, since the moment you walked out of that room without defending yourself, and I stopped. I realized something was wrong when you didn't fight back." "People who are guilty fight back," she said. "Yes. And people who are innocent?" I looked at my hands. "Sometimes they just leave." Another silence. The rain outside was relentless, threading silver down the dark windows. "You accused me," Serafina said, "of stealing the Meridian Hotel Group's rebrand campaign. In front of Forbes journalists, 8 institutional investors, the chairman of the Luxury Council, and your own board." She took a slow sip of wine. "You said, and I'm quoting from memory because I intend to be precise, that I had used my connections to intercept your confidential pitch, passed it to my team under a different name, and used it to secure their contract while poisoning their opinion of Ashford Creative." Every word landed exactly where she intended it to. "Yes," I said. "I said that." "You called me a saboteur." "I did." "You said that the luxury industry had tolerated my methods long enough." I closed my eyes briefly. "I know what I said." "I want to make sure," she said, "that you understand the specificity of the damage, not the general shape of it, the specificity." She set her glass down. "Because I've spent 11 years building a reputation for integrity in an industry that would love any excuse to take me apart, and what you gave them tonight was not a rumor. It was a testimony, in front of cameras, from the founder of the most talked-about branding agency in the Midwest. It will be in print by morning." "I know." My voice was very small. "I know, Serafina." She looked at me then, and I felt it. Not like a weapon, but like a searchlight. Like she was looking for something specific, and was deciding whether to tell me what it was. "The Meridian contract," she said, "was offered to me first. 6 weeks ago. I declined it." I blinked. "What?" "I told their chairman that the project would benefit from a younger creative perspective. I may have mentioned your agency by name." She tilted her head, watching my face process this. "A week later, you received an invitation to pitch. I assumed you'd be pleased." The room shifted. Not literally. The amber lamps and the rain and the books on their shelves stayed exactly where they were, but something in the architecture of the evening rearranged itself around a new and devastating truth. You sent them to me, I said. I recommended you. There's a distinction. A pause. I did not expect to spend the following month watching someone else try to use that connection to dismantle both of us. Dahlia, I said. The name landed in my mouth like something bitter. Seraphina's eyes sharpened just slightly. Your business partner. My partner. She's been with me since the beginning, since before the company had a name. I felt the familiar cold weight of it, the thing I'd been carrying since Livia called me 2 hours ago with the metadata report, and a voice that was very carefully not panicking. She's the one who showed me the documents. She told me she'd found them, that your team had leaked. She told you what she needed you to believe, Seraphina said, to send you to that podium. I thought about Dahlia. Dahlia with her perfect timing and her charming laugh and the way she always seemed to arrive at exactly the right moment with exactly the right information. Dahlia, who had been quietly positioning herself for months, who had been in conversations I only heard about secondhand, who had, I was beginning to understand, been doing a great deal more than managing client relationships. She was selling us, I said. It wasn't a question. The pieces had been assembling themselves in the cab, and now they clicked into something horrible and complete. She was selling the company, or trying to. Someone wanted Ashford Creative cheap, and the best way to get it cheap was to destroy both our reputation and our biggest potential contract. And while she was at it, take out the one person in the industry powerful enough to vouch for us. Seraphina said nothing, which was, I was learning, how she confirmed things. You knew, I said. You knew some version of this was happening. I suspected, she said carefully. I didn't have proof, and I couldn't share a suspicion without a source, not without making it seem like exactly the kind of move you accused me of tonight. So you stayed quiet. I stayed careful. There's a difference. For the first time, something moved across her face that wasn't control. I was trying to let you find it yourself at a pace that wouldn't... She stopped. Wouldn't what? She picked up her wineglass again. Wouldn't require you to trust me before you were ready. I sat with that. The rain came down. I was still damp, and my coat was probably ruining her sofa, and the towel in my hands had gone cold, and Seraphina Calloway was sitting 3 feet away from me, telling me she'd been protecting me without my knowledge or consent, and I had thanked her by destroying her in public. I don't know how to apologize for this, I said. I mean that literally. I rehearsed it in the cab, and every version sounds insufficient. Most honest things do, she said. She stood then, and moved toward the kitchen with the unhurried grace of someone who had never needed to rush anything in her life, and I heard the quiet sound of a kettle being filled. Tea, she said, not quite a question. You look like you need something warm. I need to take you back to understand how we got here. I need to take you back to understand why standing in that kitchen doorway, watching Seraphina Calloway make tea felt like the most disorienting thing that had ever happened to me, and why I had cried in a cab for the first time in 7 years, and why the thing I was most afraid of when I knocked on that door was not her anger, but her silence. Seraphina and I had been rivals for 4 years. I knew of her before I knew her, which is how it works in this industry. You hear the name first, attached to some extraordinary achievement or devastating business move, and then you see the photograph, and then eventually you're in the same room and the reality of a person settles around you like weather. She was the CEO of Calloway Maison by 32, the youngest in the company's history, inheriting an institution her grandmother had built and her father had nearly destroyed, and rebuilding it into something that made the original look provincial. Hotels in 7 countries, a fashion imprint, 3 private members' clubs. She was in every conversation about influence in the luxury space, and her name was said with a particular kind of reverence that I recognized as the cousin of fear. I encountered her first at the Meridian Summit 2 years before the night at her door. I had just signed my 5th significant client. Ashford Creative was still small enough that I was doing the design work myself. Still young enough in my career that walking into rooms like that, one felt like wearing borrowed clothes. She was at the podium giving the keynote, and I remember thinking she looked like someone who had been poured into the role rather than climbing into it. Nothing about her seemed effortful. She didn't notice me that night, or if she did, she gave no indication. But I noticed her and I cataloged her the way I cataloged everyone who occupied the space I wanted to be in someday. Carefully, competitively, with more admiration than I was willing to admit. The next time we were in the same room, we were competing for the Ashton Voss branding contract. I thought I had it. My pitch was original, emotionally intelligent, visually distinctive. Her pitch was apparently 2 sentences and a color swatch, and yet she walked out with the account, and I stood in the rain outside the Ashton Voss headquarters, thinking about how the game was rigged in ways I hadn't finished learning yet. After that, it happened with some regularity. Competing for the same clients, the same press coverage, the same industry awards. Usually she won. Not always. But enough that her name became a kind of measurement in my mind. Not a ceiling, not an obstacle, but a standard. A thing I was always running toward or away from, depending on the day. We spoke occasionally at events, brief professional exchanges. She was unfailingly courteous, which I found more difficult to navigate than hostility would have been. It's easier to compete with someone who dislikes you, someone who treats you with impeccable professional respect, and then continues to win anyway, is a more complicated problem. I told Livia once that Serafina Calloway made me feel like a very good rough draft. Livia, who has always been honest to the point of minor cruelty, told me that sounded less like rivalry and more like a crush, and that I should examine that seriously before I did something stupid. I had apparently not examined it seriously enough. "The tea is ready," Serafina said from the kitchen. I went to the kitchen. She had made it properly. The kind of tea that requires actual thought, not a bag dropped into microwaved water. She handed me a mug without ceremony and leaned against the counter and looked at me with that searchlight quality again. "You should stay," she said. I stared at her. "I'm sorry." "The storm." She gestured toward the window where the rain had intensified into something that sounded genuinely hostile. "I'm not sending you home in that. The roads will be a problem, and you're already half drowned." A pause. "The guest room is through the hall. I'll find you something dry to sleep in." I thought of about 6 different reasons to refuse, and she watched me think of them with an expression of calm patience that suggested she would wait through all 6 and then simply repeat the offer. "All right," I said. She disappeared for a few minutes and returned with a folded set of clothes. Soft sleep shorts and a button-down silk shirt that was unmistakably hers. Deep burgundy, impossibly soft, that smelled of her perfume when she held it out to me. Something with sandalwood in it. Something I would not be thinking about. "The bathroom is the second door," she said. I changed in a bathroom that was the most intimidating bathroom I had ever been in. All pale stone and a rainfall shower and mirrors that somehow made me look like a person who had been through something meaningful rather than just a person who had been stupid and wet. I put on the silk shirt and stood there for a moment, breathing it in. The sandalwood, the faint trace of her, and I told myself to stop, firmly, and went back out. She was at the kitchen table, her robe tied properly now, reading through the folder of papers with a red pen in her hand. She had put on reading glasses I had never seen before. Slim gold frames, and the sight of them did something entirely inconvenient to my chest. She looked up when I came in, and her gaze moved over me in a way that was entirely composed, and also somehow not. "Sit," she said. "Tell me what you know about Dahlia's movements over the last 3 months." So we worked. We sat at her kitchen table past midnight with tea going cold between us and her notes spread over mine, building a picture of what Dahlia had done and what we could prove and what we would need. She was precise and efficient and utterly without sentimentality about the situation, which I found steadying rather than cold. She asked good questions. the kind that found the gaps I hadn't noticed in my own account, and she listened to my answers with a focus I wasn't used to. Most people in meetings listened while already forming their next point, but she seemed to actually receive what I said before responding. At some point, she got up to make more tea, and I said, without planning to, "Why didn't you fight back? Tonight? At the summit when I stopped. You could have said something. Defended yourself publicly, right there, in front of all of them. You had the standing to do it." She stood with her back to me, pouring water. "Yes," she said. "So why didn't you?" A pause. "Because you believed it." She turned around, and her expression was complicated in a way that she was not quite managing to smooth over. "You stood at that podium, and you were furious and certain. And if I had stood up and contested it in that moment, in front of those cameras, it would have looked exactly like the thing you were accusing me of. It would have looked like a powerful woman trying to crush a smaller one." She came back to the table. "And because—" She stopped. "Because what?" She sat down and looked at her tea. "You've worked so hard to build what you've built. The idea that someone in your own company was gutting it from the inside. I didn't want to be the person who made you face that in public, with journalists watching." The thing in my chest tightened again, unreasonably. "That's—" I searched for the right word. "That's a very strange form of mercy, from someone I just publicly accused of being a thief." Something shifted in her expression. The smallest thing. "I've been accused of worse," she said, "by people who had less reason." We looked at each other for a moment, and then she looked back at her papers, and I looked back at mine, and neither of us said anything else about it. I fell asleep at the table. I didn't mean to. I was reading through a contract timeline, trying to find the date discrepancy Livia had flagged, and then I was somewhere warm and dark and quiet. And when I surfaced what felt like minutes later, I was lying on the sofa with a blanket over me that had not been there before, and the amber lamps had been dimmed. And from the direction of the kitchen, I could hear the faint sound of someone working very quietly, so as not to wake me. I lay there in Seraphina Calloway's silk shirt under Seraphina Calloway's blanket and listened to her work, and felt something shift in the architecture of myself that I had been keeping carefully unchanged for years. In the morning, there was coffee. She made it the way I liked it, an Americano, extra shot, no milk. And I didn't realize until she set it in front of me without asking that she had known exactly how I took it. "How do you—" I started. "You order it at every industry event we've both attended," she said behind her own cup. "It's not surveillance, it's observation." "Observation implies you were paying attention to me." She looked at me over the rim of her cup, said nothing. The morning was strange and not unpleasant. She had already been up for hours, apparently, and had dressed with her usual precision. A charcoal suit, hair up, the armor back in place. I was still in her silk shirt and the borrowed shorts, and I was very aware of the contrast. She treated it with such natural composure that I eventually stopped feeling strange about it and started making notes on the contract timeline, and we worked through breakfast, and it felt, unexpectedly, like something I could have gotten used to. My phone buzzed at 9. Livia, with 3 exclamations and a string of texts that I would need to deal with. "I have to go," I said. Seraphina nodded. "There's a car service in the building. I'll have them bring one around." She was already reaching for her own phone. "Your clothes from last night are hanging in the hall." "I had them run through the dryer." I stood in the middle of her kitchen holding a half-drunk cup of coffee. That was exactly how I liked it. And I thought, you have watched me for years, long enough to know how I move and how I think and what I need before I need it. And you sent me the Meridian group because you thought I was good enough for it. And you let me destroy you last night rather than destroy me back. And you made me tea and gave me your shirt and covered me with a blanket while I slept. And you are standing there in your perfect charcoal suit, like none of this touches you. And I do not believe for 1 second that it doesn't. "Seraphina," I said. She looked up. "I don't just need your forgiveness. I said. I need to fix it. Publicly. The same way I broke it. I held her gaze. I want you to know that's not something I'm willing to let go. She was quiet for a moment. Then something moved very briefly across her face, not the small composure crack from the night before, but something more deliberate. Something she was choosing to let me see. I know, she said. 3 days later, we were at Livia's table in the Ashford Creative Studio, which is the opposite of Seraphina's penthouse in nearly every conceivable way. A converted loft in the River North neighborhood with exposed brick and the faint smell of coffee and someone's forgotten lunch. Design boards on every wall, cables running across the floor, evidence of creative chaos everywhere. Livia, who is exactly as described when I've tried to explain her to people, 5'2", brown-skinned, very direct, capable of rendering a spreadsheet and a person's entire psychology in the same breath, took one look at Seraphina Calloway, standing in the doorway of our studio, and said, without a trace of ceremony, "You're taller in person, and you have significantly better shoes than I expected." Seraphina looked at Livia for a moment. "You must be the one who caught the metadata." "I caught it at 11:53 p.m. after 6 hours of staring at contracts," Livia said, "and I'd like that noted somewhere official." She looked at me. "I'll make more coffee. This is going to be a very long morning." It was. We laid everything out. The timeline of Dahlia's movements, the clients she'd approached quietly, the altered documents, the conversations Livia had been reconstructing from calendar records and message threads. The picture that emerged was specific and ugly. Dahlia had been in negotiation for months with a private equity group trying to acquire a controlling stake in Ashford Creative. The asking price was low, and the way to lower it further was to damage the company's flagship contracts and eliminate the one major industry figure who might intervene to support us. "She was afraid of you," I told Seraphina. "Most people in her position would be," Seraphina said, without particular pride. She was sitting across the work table from me with a notepad and a pen, very much at home in a room she had never been in before, and I caught Livia watching the two of us with an expression I chose not to decode. "So what do we do?" I asked. "We build the case," Seraphina said. "Carefully. We give her enough rope and enough reason to feel confident before we pull it." She looked at her notes. "I have relationships with the PE Group's senior board. Not warm relationships, but professional ones. I can arrange a meeting that will draw her out." She paused. "We'll need proof of the forged documents, which you have. We'll need proof of the unauthorized negotiations, which I can help you obtain. And we'll need a moment, public enough to matter." "The Bellamy Group dinner," Livia said. 4 weeks. Half the investors in this city will be there." Seraphina and I looked at each other. 4 weeks, I said. "It'll be enough," she said. And so we began. What followed was 4 weeks of the strangest, most intense, most careful collaboration I had ever experienced. And I have been in a lot of intense collaborations. We worked in her glass boardroom at Callaway Maison, which was everything I'd imagined. Soaring ceilings, north light, a view of the lake, and a table long enough to make you feel like you were participating in something historical. We worked in the studio. We worked in the back room of a private members club called The Verity, all dark leather and low light, where Seraphina apparently had a standing table, and where she was greeted by name with a warmth that told me she was known here as a person and not just a client. One afternoon, we were at a Callaway Maison hotel under renovation on the north side, walking through an empty ballroom that smelled of fresh plaster and cut wood, reviewing some documents that had been stored in one of the site offices, and Seraphina was moving through the unfinished space with the same authority she moved through everything. And I said a little recklessly, "Is this what it feels like to be you all the time? Just completely at home everywhere?" She turned to look at me. We were the only two people in a half-finished ballroom, our footsteps echoing on temporary flooring, autumn light coming sideways through the tall windows. "No," she said. "No? Most spaces feel like performance. She looked around the empty room. Places like this are easier, before they've been populated with expectation. I thought about that. That's a surprisingly honest thing to say. I have my moments. She turned back to the documents. Don't make a note of it. But I did, privately, make a note of it. She remembered things about me, not in an invasive way, in the way of someone who has paid quiet attention for a long time. She knew that I got headaches if I skipped lunch, so when we had long working sessions that ran past noon, food appeared. She knew I found certain kinds of small talk actively exhausting, so she didn't make me do it. When we were at an investor event, and a man who had ignored me for the better part of an hour turned to ask Serafina something that was, in fact, a question about my work, she redirected it to me with a smoothness that looked accidental but wasn't. And I felt the particular warmth of being defended by someone who chose to do it quietly. I, in turn, paid attention to her in ways I was trying not to catalog. That she took her coffee black and very hot and would not drink it once it cooled. That she had a very precise handshake. Not the power grip many executives used, but something measured and equal, as if she believed a handshake was a conversation rather than a dominance display. That she smiled rarely in professional settings, but when she did, genuinely not the polished public event version, it transformed her face into something I found difficult to look directly at. That she had a habit, when she was thinking through a problem, of pressing one knuckle briefly against her lower lip. Not a dramatic gesture, barely visible, actually, but I noticed it every time, because it was one of the few places the control showed its seams. A tell she'd never bothered to eliminate, because no one else had been watching closely enough to notice. That there were moments, late in the evening when we'd been working for hours, when she let the control slip slightly. When she ran her hand through her hair, which she almost never did. When she said something dry and funny with perfect timing and then looked immediately back at her papers, as if she hadn't said it. When she was quiet, in a way that wasn't composure, but something else. Fatigue, or loneliness, or something she hadn't named. One evening at the Verity, late, after a meeting with a contact of hers who had information about the PE group's negotiations, we were the last two people in the back room, and I was watching her make notes with that red pen, and I said, "You've never tried to take me down. In 4 years of competing." She looked up. "You could have," I said. "There were moments. The Ashton Voss pitch, the Meridian thing. You had leverage multiple times that you never used." "Why would I?" she said. "Because that's how it works. Because I was competition." She set the pen down and looked at me with an expression I was getting better at reading. Not warm exactly, but unguarded. "You've never understood what you look like from the outside," she said, "to people watching you work." "What do I look like?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Like someone who is building something real and knows it. Like someone who is genuinely afraid and keeps going anyway." A pause. "That's not the profile of someone I want to diminish. It's the profile of someone I wanted to see succeed." I sat across from her in the low light of the Verity's back room and felt the thing I had been refusing to name for several days now push up against the walls I'd built for it with considerably more force than before. "That sounds a lot like admiration," I said. My voice was very careful. She picked the pen back up. "Don't make me repeat it," she said, and went back to her notes. But she had said it, and I kept it. There was a night, week 2 of the 4, when we were at a hotel suite in Milwaukee, where Serafina had a meeting and I'd come along because the PE group contact was based there, and we thought we could double task the trip. The contact had canceled at the last minute. We'd had the meeting Serafina needed, which ran 3 hours and left me with a headache and her with a very controlled expression that I'd learned meant frustrated but unwilling to show it. We ended up in the hotel suite's sitting room, too late to eat anywhere decent, ordering room service and sitting at opposite ends of a sofa with our laptops and a bottle of wine between us. And at some point, the work conversation became a different kind of conversation. She told me about her grandmother, the one who had built Callaway Maison from a single property in Lyon into what it had become. A woman apparently so formidable that Seraphina's voice went quiet and precise when she talked about her. Not out of sadness, but out of something more complicated than sadness. She would have been difficult to love, Seraphina said, if you were her family. She was extraordinary in the way that requires a great deal from the people nearest to it. Is that what you are? I asked. She looked at me. I try not to be. Is that why? I hesitated. You live alone, in that beautiful apartment. The guest room with nothing personal in it? She was very still. That's an observation. I told you that you were allowed to observe things about me, I said. It seems only fair. A pause. I live alone because I have been largely easier to be around in professional contexts than personal ones. She said it without self-pity, which made it worse. I was in a relationship for 3 years that ended because she said I treated love the same way I treated contracts. Precisely. At arm's length. With exit clauses built in. A beat. She wasn't wrong. Were you in love with her? I asked. She considered this. I think I was very serious about her. I'm not sure that's the same thing. I looked at her in the hotel suite light, wine glass in hand, laptop closed. Hair slightly less precise than it was in the morning, and I thought, you are not what anyone thinks you are. You are not what I thought you were. What happened? I asked, after it ended. I became better at my job, she said, which was always easier than the other thing. I thought about my own history, a string of almost relationships that I'd treated with a similar carefulness, a similar protective distance. I thought about how much of my life I'd spent in rooms like this one, working, building, and how little time I'd spent in rooms that felt like the one she'd described, populated with expectation. I do that too, I said. She looked at me, not surprised, just looking. The distance thing, I said. I'm very good at it. I know, she said. I've watched you deflect attention from yourself in every room we've shared. I didn't realize you noticed. Rowan. Her voice was very low. I noticed everything. We were too close on the sofa. I wasn't sure when that had happened. Some gradual drift during the conversation. The way proximity moves when you're not watching it. She was looking at me with an expression I now recognized as the one she rarely allowed, and her hair had come slightly loose, and she had her wine glass tilted toward me because she'd turned to talk to me, and I was right there, and she leaned back, just fractionally, just enough to reestablish the distance. You should sleep, she said. We have the drive back in the morning? I breathed. Right, I said. Yes. I went to the second room of the suite and lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the quiet sounds of her moving around the sitting room, and I thought about all the words I had been collecting since the night she opened her door in midnight silk, and I thought about the fact that I was falling in love with Seraphina Calloway and had almost certainly been doing so for longer than this. Week 3 brought a complication. At an investor event at the Calloway Maison Chicago Hotel, one of the gatherings we were attending as part of the careful movement around Dahlia's scheme, a man named Theron Beck appeared. He was an investor adjacent to the PE group, charming in the practiced way of people who have learned that charm is a professional tool, and he attached himself to me at the bar with an interest that felt partly genuine and partly strategic and entirely unwelcome. Ashford Creative, he said, with the smile of someone placing a bet. I've been watching your trajectory. Impressive, especially given the recent press. The recent press, I said, is being addressed. Of course. He touched my arm. Brief, casual. I hope whoever's looking after your interests is doing it properly. These situations require a very specific kind of management. From across the room, Seraphina watched. I knew she was watching because she had a way of watching me that I had started to feel rather than see, a kind of attention with physical weight. She was talking to 2 people from the Meridian Group's board, and she was smiling and saying the right things, and her eyes had gone to a temperature I recognized as very controlled displeasure. He touched my arm again, making a point about investment strategy that was also not really about investment strategy. And I watched Seraphina's expression do something extremely subtle that I wouldn't have noticed 3 weeks ago. I excused myself from Theron Beck with the professionally pleasant goodbye I kept on hand for exactly these situations, and moved toward the window, and Seraphina appeared beside me approximately 90 seconds later. "Theron Beck," she said. "I know. He's an advisor to Aldrich Capital, the PE group with the acquisition interest." I looked at her. "He wasn't just flirting. He was absolutely flirting," she said, "and gathering intelligence simultaneously. He's very practiced." A pause, and her voice went precise in a way that suggested careful management. "You handled it well. You were watching. I was keeping track of the room." "Seraphina." She looked at me. Her jaw was very set. "You don't have to keep managing the temperature of how you feel about things," I said quietly. "Not with me. Not right now." A beat. Her expression was extremely still. Then, "This is not the appropriate venue for that conversation." "I know," I said, "but I want you to know I noticed." Later, much later, back at the Verity, both of us tired and slightly tense from the event, she said into a silence I'd let sit for a while, "I hated watching him touch your arm." I looked at her. "Which I have no right to," she continued in the same measured tone, as if she was reporting a fact rather than a feeling. "And which I'm not going to pretend is something other than what it is." "What is it?" I said. She looked at her hands. "Wanting something I don't have any claim on." "You could have a claim on it," I said, "if you asked for one." She was quiet for what felt like a long time. "You're still in the middle of a crisis," she said finally, "that I am partly responsible for by letting things get as far as they did. It would not be appropriate for me to—" She stopped. "I don't want you to feel grateful. I don't want anything that comes from gratitude or adrenaline or proximity." "That is extremely noble," I said, "and also slightly infuriating." Something flickered in her face. "Is it?" "I am telling you, Seraphina, that what I feel is not gratitude. I am telling you that I have been paying attention to you for 4 years from a great distance and now from a very close one, and that none of what I feel resembles obligation." I held her gaze. "But if you need more time to believe that, I'll wait." She looked at me for a long, careful moment. "You're very certain for someone who was calling me a saboteur 3 weeks ago," she said. "I was wrong then," I said. "I'm not wrong now." She did not say anything else that night, but she held the door of the Verity open for me on the way out, with a hand pressed very briefly to my lower back, and that small, careful gesture burned like a brand all the way home. The last week before the Bellamy dinner was the hardest. It started with a misunderstanding that felt, in the moment, catastrophic. Livia found a document, a proposal, drafted in the early months of Dahlia's maneuvering, that suggested Seraphina's legal team had been consulted about the acquisition process. Not as a buyer, not as a seller, but as advisors who had been approached early on to provide an opinion. I called Seraphina. She answered immediately. "Did your legal team advise Aldrich Capital?" I asked. I was trying to keep my voice even. A pause. "They were approached for an opinion on a preliminary proposal. My general counsel declined and informed me of the approach." "When?" "Early July." "You knew in July," I said. "You knew someone was circling my company in July." "I knew someone had made an approach. I didn't know the specifics until significantly later." Her voice was very careful. "Rowan? You had information that affected me and you didn't tell me," I said. "I had a fragment of information that—" "How many times?" The controlled tone cracked slightly. "How many times did you have information that touched my company and make the choice to manage it quietly instead of telling me?" Silence. "I understand why you're angry," she said. "I need you to understand that I'm not angry, because I'm ungrateful." I'm angry because I needed you to treat me like an equal, Serafina, not like a project. Another pause. Longer. That was never my intention, she said. I was trying to protect. I know what you were trying to do, I said. I just needed you to do it differently. I hung up, and then I sat in my studio alone and felt the specific grief of having found someone extraordinary, and then not quite being able to bridge the last distance. She didn't call back that night. I didn't call her. I sat in the studio past midnight looking at the design boards and the evidence files and the life I had built that was in the process of being saved, at least partially by a woman I had managed to push away with the same hands I'd used to reach for her. She sent a message at 2 a.m. No greeting, no apology, no explanation, just a document attached with a note. Everything I knew, and when I knew it, and what I didn't know. I should have given you this 2 weeks ago. I'm sorry. I opened the document. She had written it carefully, the way she did everything carefully. The dates, the decisions, the things she'd held back and why, and what she'd been afraid would happen if she didn't. Not to herself, but to me, to my company, to the autonomy she could see I'd built at significant personal cost and didn't want to undermine. It was not a perfect document. There were choices in it I would have made differently, but it was honest, thoroughly, painstakingly honest. I read it twice. Then I wrote back, "Thank you. See you at Bellamy." The night of the Bellamy Group dinner arrived cold and clear, the kind of Chicago November evening that strips everything down to its essential quality. Dahlia was there. We had made sure she was there, through a carefully placed invitation from one of Serafina's contacts that she couldn't refuse. She came in her best dress and her most assured smile. And when she saw me across the room, she gave the version of that smile that was specifically for me. The warm one, the one I used to trust. Serafina and I had agreed. She would not manage this. She would be present, and she would be ready to back me with whatever she had on the corporate side, but the confrontation was mine. Because the only thing that mattered in the end was that I take responsibility for what I had broken and fix it myself. I was terrified. I want to be honest about that. I found Dahlia near the bar. "Rowan?" she said, with the ease of someone who had not considered the possibility that I knew. "You look wonderful. How are you holding up after everything?" "Dahlia," I said, "I need to talk to you." "Of course. Let's find a quiet corner." "No," I said. "Here. Now." She studied me for a moment and something moved very quickly behind her eyes. "I know about Aldrich Capital," I said. "I know about the document alterations. I know about the Meridian pitch. I know you've been selling the company while I was running it." I kept my voice level. Not cold. Clear. "I know you framed Serafina Calloway and used me to damage her publicly because she was the one person with both the knowledge and the standing to protect what we'd built." She said nothing. For once, she had nothing immediate. "I also know," I said, "that a significant number of the people in this room have been provided with the documentation to prove all of it, including the forged metadata and your communication records with the acquisition team." A pause. "That's not a threat. That's a fact." "Rowan, we're done," I said. "Everything we built together, I'm grateful for what it was before you decided to burn it. But we're done." I turned and I did not look at her again. The evening had a quality of unreality after that, the way events do when you've been dreading them for long enough that they become strange when they finally arrive. Investors who had heard, through the careful channels of industry gossip, that something was being set right. Journalists who had printed the original accusation and would now need to find a correction. The chairman of the Luxury Council, who caught my eye across the room with an expression that suggested he had been waiting to see what I would do. I went to the center of the room. I am not, by nature, someone who makes public speeches. I am the person who makes beautiful things behind closed doors and lets the work speak. But some moments require the human voice and not the design board. I said, 3 weeks ago, I stood at a summit and said things about Serafina Calloway that were false and cruel and wrong. I said them because I believed I had evidence, and the evidence had been manufactured to deceive me. I was wrong, and I was publicly wrong, and I owe her a public correction. I looked around the room. I owe her considerably more than that, but this is the one I can offer tonight. And then I looked at Serafina, who was standing at the edge of the room in a dress the color of dark copper that I hadn't seen before, and who was looking at me with an expression I could read now, could read the way I read design concepts I'd spent a long time with, all the layers at once. And I said, she has been more honest with me than I deserve and more patient than I earned, and she built something extraordinary. And she has my complete and unreserved apology and my complete and unreserved respect. Applause. Not the kind that fills the room, but the kind that means something. Specific people choosing it. Serafina moved through the room toward me with that unhurried grace, and when she reached me, she looked at me for a moment and said, very quietly, so only I could hear, "You're better at this than you think." I had a very good reason, I said. She was very close. I could smell the sandalwood. We should talk, she said. Yes, I said. We absolutely should. We talked. We left the Bellamy dinner early, both of us, which was noticed and would be discussed, and we drove to the Verity, which was nearly empty at that hour, and we sat in the back room that had become something like ours over the course of 4 weeks, and we had the conversation that had been building since she opened her door in midnight silk and said, "You're late." She said, "I should have told you everything earlier. The consultation, the July contact. I protected you in a way that undermined you, and I understand why that felt like a betrayal." I said, "I should have trusted you. When you didn't fight back at the summit, I knew somewhere that it meant something. I chose to believe the evidence instead of my own read of you." She said, "You barely knew me." I said, "I knew enough." A pause. The low light of the Verity, the leather smell, and the quiet. "Rowan," she said, "I want to say something that I don't say carefully or strategically, and it may make things more complicated, and I'm going to say it anyway." I looked at her. "I have been watching you," she said, "for 4 years. Not as competition, not as a project. Because you are remarkable, and you move through the world with this combination of absolute certainty about your work and complete vulnerability about everything else, and I find it, she stopped. Started again. "I find you very difficult to be around without wanting things I'm not sure I'm equipped to handle properly." I thought about what she'd said in the hotel suite about the woman who left, about love like a contract. "You're afraid," I said. "Profoundly," she said. "So am I," said. She looked at me. "The searchlight quality, but softer now. The distance thing," I said. "That we both do. I don't want to do it with you." I leaned forward slightly. "I want to try not to." She held my gaze for a long, still moment. And then she said, "Come here," in a voice so low it barely traveled, and I did. She kissed me first, which surprised me, because I'd expected her to maintain the last inch of composure to the end. But she reached up and took my face in both her hands with a precision and a gentleness that felt like the most honest thing I had ever witnessed. And she kissed me, and it was nothing like the practiced elegance I had expected. It was hungry and a little undone and completely real, and I kissed her back with everything I'd been holding for 4 years of watching from across expensive rooms. When we broke apart, she was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Something open and undefended. Something she hadn't learned to compose yet. 4 years, she said. 4 years, I agreed. She laughed, very quietly. And I had not, in 4 years of watching her, ever heard Serafina Calloway laugh like that. Not the polished sound she used at events, but something real, low, briefly helpless. I thought, I want to collect these. Every real sound she makes, every moment she forgets to manage herself. I said so, and she looked startled, and then the laugh returned, and I kissed her again. The months after were different. Not easy, nothing worth having is easy, but different in the way that means better. Dahlia resigned and was removed from the company. The documentation went to the appropriate people, and the Aldrich Capital acquisition attempt collapsed quietly, which was satisfying in the measured way of things that simply ceased to be problems. Livia sent me a very long message the morning it was confirmed that consisted primarily of relief and one very pointed observation about decisions I had made under pressure that she would be holding over me for the rest of my natural life. I told her she had earned the right. The Meridian Group contract came back. It was smaller than the original scope, but it was real, and it was ours, and we built something extraordinary with it. A visual identity system that several publications called definitional for a certain kind of contemporary luxury. I'm proud of it. I'm proud of what my team did with it. Serafina and I were careful in public. At first, the way you are careful with something new that you don't want broken by too much exposure. We appeared at separate events and arrived at shared ones from different directions and kept the professional collaboration front and center. But Chicago, as it turns out, is not a city where two women who look at each other the way we look at each other go unnoticed for very long. And by February, the industry press had reached its own conclusions, and we agreed, quietly over dinner at the Verity, that we were not going to pretend otherwise. She came to the studio more often. She said she found it easier to think there than in the boardroom, which Livia received with immense satisfaction, and which I received with the warm bewilderment of someone who had spent years believing Serafina Calloway existed only in immaculate spaces, and found instead that she was perfectly at home on a chair in a room full of design boards and cable runs, red pen in hand, reading glasses on entirely herself. I found the reading glasses increasingly difficult to be rational around. We collaborated on a project. It came together naturally, which I should have expected. Callaway Maison was renovating a property in the Gold Coast into a boutique hotel, and the branding needed to feel modern and rooted at once, intimate and elevated. And Serafina said over breakfast one morning that she couldn't find anyone who seemed to understand what she was going for. And I said I understood exactly what she was going for, and she looked at me, and we were in business again. It was different from before, better. We fought occasionally, not the cold distances of the early days, but actual arguments, the kind where someone says something honest and the other person pushes back, and then you find your way through to something better than where you started. She was right more often than I liked, and I told her so, and she received the compliment with a composure that was entirely transparent. The hotel opened in April. We held a private event on the rooftop garden, the one that had been part of the renovation. A real garden, not an architectural gesture, with raised beds of flowering things and low string lights and the city laid out below it in the spring evening. Livia had overseen the event details, which meant it was flawless, and also that the catering was excellent, because Livia has opinions about catering. I arrived late. I had been in a client meeting that ran over, and by the time I got to the rooftop, the evening was already beautiful and already full of people, and for a moment, standing in the doorway, I couldn't find her in the crowd. Then I did. She was near the garden's edge, standing with a glass of wine in hand and her dark hair loose, as it had been on the night she opened the door in silk. And she was talking to someone, but she had been watching the door, and when she saw me, something moved in her expression. Not the controlled warmth she offered everyone else, but the specific, unguarded thing she'd started giving me. She excused herself from the conversation and moved toward me with that unhurried grace, and when she was close, she looked me over the way she'd looked me over the first night. But differently now. Not assessing damage, just seeing me. "You're late," she said. And there it was. The same words, the same voice, but everything else transformed. No silk and danger and guilt, no rain and ruin, Just the rooftop garden and the city lights and the flowering things and the specific, irreplaceable warmth of a woman who had decided I was worth waiting for. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." She reached out and straightened the collar of my jacket with the precise, intimate gesture she'd claimed at some point in the last 4 months as naturally as breathing. "You're forgiven," she said. "You always are." I took her hand before she could step back. Held it. "I love you," I said. I had said it before, but I liked saying it. I intended to keep saying it until it stopped being new. Something moved in her face, that open, undefended expression, the one she didn't know how to compose. "I know," she said. "I love you." I pulled her forward and kissed her in front of everyone on that rooftop, which was noticed and would be discussed, and she was warm, and she was real, and she tasted like the wine, and she kissed me back with both hands holding my face the way she always did, like I was something she had chosen very deliberately and was not about to let go. Below us, the city was gold and endless. Behind us, the garden was in bloom. And Seraphina Calloway, who was called cold and untouchable and impossible to impress, was laughing against my mouth, quiet and real and briefly helpless, and I thought, this is what I was building toward. All those years in all those expensive rooms. This is what I did not know I was running toward, and I was at last exactly on time.